So I'm going to now move into the more serious talk. So this is of course a picture. It's pretty famous of the Tower of Babel, and the idea of the Tower of Babel was, of course, that we were trying to build this massive structure to get up to the sky to meet with God, but we couldn't get our act together down on Earth, and God actually shattered this and fragmented the languages, and this is why we have miscommunication. But it's also a measurement story, and if you read the story, there's a lot of debate about how do we measure and how do we build this damn thing. And this is the situation we're in. Multiple fronts where measurement is not interfacing with reality anymore. Multiple fronts where a false sense of reality is being created, and where power is overriding the interest of the good. So it's actually a mutually amplifying crisis. And it's a crisis in the technical, Wilberian, Habermasian kind of developmental, structural sense of the word, which is to say it's a crisis that demands either vertical structural reorganization or regression, because it's not something that we can't stay in this. That's my argument, that this is one of those turning points, catastrophic bifurcation. So it's not a crisis like, this really sucks. It's a crisis in a structural sense, and it's the structures of measurement that need to change. So if we're talking about a post-capitalist economy, if we're talking about an actually sustainable form of human civilization, we're talking about a fundamentally different measurement infrastructure at the basis of it. That's the claim. So I'm going to run through these crises economics first. So this is a Berkshire. This is actually a form of alternative currency that circulates in the Berkshires. If you live in like Great Barrington, you can live most of your life just circulating with these forms of currency. Now, it's interesting. Now, this is not a great model. It's owned by a for-profit company. It's kind of cute. You have to pay your taxes, of course, in American dollars. But the idea that money is a fundamental form of measurement is very important. And one of the things that money does is homogenize the measurement of value. Right? The neoliberal consensus that we have has essentially said that there's one way to measure value in the world, right? And it is money. And I'm not going to get into kind of Marxist theories of how that distorts and alienates us, but you can see. And we've all experienced it. When you take certain things, for example, like childcare, and put a price on them, it becomes a different kind of thing because you've quantified something that is typically understood to be not quantifiable. And we're increasingly invading the life world by turning it into things that can have a price tag, right? Like the tragedy of capitalism in one way is the idea that we have to put a price on things that are priceless, right? And that's a measurement issue. And then, of course, there's just econometrics, which is like, to my mind, like one of the most ridiculous sciences. So GDP is the classic thing you'd see here. And what you'd see if you had this figure on GDP is fluctuation, but generally a rising gross domestic product globally. This is called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is just as simple to produce as the GDP, in a way, but it tracks economic inequality. It tracks within country economic inequality. So what this says is economic inequality has been going up drastically since the 80s, right? But so has GDP. Now, which one do we value? And which one do we use in debates about policy? And which ones do we use to talk about the health of national economies? GDP, which oversimplifies and neglects within country variability. It's a basic issue, right? And then there's all of these things in economics that have to do with the valuation and measurement of risk, right? The main reason we had in 2007 an economic crisis was because these financiers were creating these collateralized debt obligations, and then there were these rating agencies that said those are dope investments. Like they had a 4-point scale of measurement of risk on investment, and they were like, this is high yield. They were colluding with the financiers to basically extract wealth from extremely vulnerable populations. And then the whole thing came crashing down. But that was about power colluding with measure to distort reality and to create a different and unjust situation. Education, this is my field. I've got a book coming out about educational measurement and social justice. This is a picture of a testing boycott in Seattle in 2013. And these people are walking out, and they're just not doing it anymore. To me, this is one of the most exciting things I've seen. And I'm in touch with these people, and there's a real growing movement to say that the problem in educational reform, what's backing the marketization and the privatization of education, what's backing the increasing use of psychotropics among school-aged kids, It mostly can be brought down to the testing infrastructure, and a lot of that can be brought down to what I just described. The need to put a price on what is priceless, right? And the need to quantify what has traditionally been unquantifiable. The need to take something that we used to have for free away from us and sell it back to us, right? And this is what Habermas talked about as the invasion of the life world by the system. And one of the ways you do that is by measuring more of what used to not be measured. And we used to not even think about measuring. And now we measure everything that moves in education as well. Environment, right? I mean, environmental measures are extremely contentious political topic, right? And so this is one of these maps that shows a distribution of temperature change around the world. And this is an aggregate measure of tens of thousands of measurement instances, each one of which has these parameters of estimation around it. This is actually a very complex epistemological object that most people accept at face value, right? There are huge regions where no measures are taken at all. And you know in a complex dynamical system, you need as much measurement everywhere. I'm not saying this is bad science, but I'm saying that we don't actually know the extent of the situation we're dealing with because we have simple ways of modeling extremely complicated phenomenon. This is, and this relates to the climate crisis, this is a water meter that you can put on your faucet, and that will tell you how much water you're using in a day, right? And that seems like a great idea, and I agree that it is. But as the economic crisis deepens, what we're going to see is increasing policy and increasing use of force to bring measurement into the distribution of scarce resources. And so I see a future where, as the economic and ecological crisis gets more complex, our lives get constrained in extremely radical ways. And most of that's going to happen through measurement, you know. People are, you know, think about your electric meter, you know. So, and this, they're going to measure your water.
Your water bill in California.
Yeah, your water bill. I mean, they measure your water, but this is precise, you know. So, okay, politics, another area where measurement is a mess. This is a poll about political polls, right? That's how it's gotten, like, and it's about what polls do we trust. And I'm not going to get into the details here, but my point is that political polling is an incredibly crude way to get a sense of the nature of what the people are thinking. It's the opposite of participatory democracy. It's a forced choice equation where they give you several options and you're forced to pick one of them. It's like a standardized test, right? And so it's not an insight into the people. This is an electronic voting booth, right? Voting is one of the most basic forms of measurement and created in the ancient world. They had all these systems from the volume of applause to everyone leaves a marble in a different bucket as they leave the auditorium, all these different ways to try to get a sense of how do we measure the mood of the people. And participatory democracy is one thing. Where you vote, go, no go, is a very other thing. And I think we underestimate the way that our political debates are polarized simply as a result of the basic technology that we use to make democratic decisions, which is, again, a forced choice and standardized testing called selected response, right? Deliberative democracy is constructive response. And I'm not going to get into that distinction, but it's very important to think about a future where we do forms of political decision-making that have nothing to do with voting in any simple way. Right now, we have a form of politics which is spectatorship and voting, and it models precisely advertising and consuming. And it's a very tight relationship. I mean, the Super Bowl and a presidential campaign sell a lot of commercials. So health, right? This is the DSM. Everyone knows the DSM. It's been a little bit defunct, but I put it on here just to kind of put into the space. There's this huge and proliferating area of medical diagnostics and medical diagnostic technology. And I'm not going to say this is good or bad, that it's proliferating, but I'm going to say that we have created an incredibly complex medical bureaucracy based fundamentally on measures. And we have a reductive sense of the nature of disease. So we have kind of isolated forms of medical measurement that really distort the full complexity of the human. So that's one aspect of medical measurement. And then this is the Human Genome Project. Medical diagnostics are actually about 10 to 15 years behind where they could be if we were using everything we knew about customized medicine and genetics. The main reason that's the case, I think, is because we have a for-profit healthcare industry in the United States. And you're never going to have a healthcare industry that actually cures people and is for profit, right? And it's simple. As soon as you cure someone, they don't come back to give you more money. If you want to make money in medicine, you need to create chronic dependence on disease, right? Or drugs that create side effects that you can treat with other drugs, which is what happens. So personality, I love this thing. So this is the standardized service worker, and this is a White Castle Corporation thing from 1931. What's interesting about this is, there's all the physical things you need to do, but here there's an arrow pointing at his brain that says, be ready to make a suggestion. So they're not even telling you to just standardize the way you look. They're telling you to standardize your mental state as a worker. And so one of the main organizations that I've got my eye on is the International Standards Organization, which probably no one's ever heard of. So ISO 9000, has anyone ever heard of ISO 9000? Yeah. So ISO 9000 affects millions and millions of people. And none of those people had a say in the creation of this. ISO 9000 is essentially a massive human resource kind of management system. So any huge multinational has to follow the policies of ISO 9000. And the people affected by those policies have no idea and were never consulted. And if you look at the way it was created and the nature of the International Standards Organization, it is built essentially as a way to control labor. And it was put in place, again, in the 70s. So that's the scary stuff, and that was very quickly. And you read my paper, you can get more. And I'm going to expand it into a book because I think it's a critical issue. But you can see that there's this complex compounding crisis, and it relates epistemology with ontology and ethics and all of these things together. But it's grounding out of the fact that if we created different measures, we would have a very different world. And if different measures had been decided on at some prior point in history, the trajectory of where it would be different. So I want to talk about kind of preferable futures for measurement. So I think we need to actually reconsider the nature of the anthropocentric measurement systems. One of the things we lost with the metric system was a system that made any references to the dimensionality of the human form. And so that's why we have massive impersonal forms of infrastructure and alienating standardized McMansions. And there have been a couple architects who've pushed back against this and refused to use standard forms and create their own anthropocentric forms, and you get much more beautiful buildings. So I think we have to understand the value of the universal measure, but also think about the local, the particular, and the human scale. So that's one thing. I'm going to talk more about this valorization of the unique and how important it is on a later slide. So the dynamic systems and complexity is something I'm talking about here. One or two measures taken on one or two variables once or twice is never enough to understand a complex phenomenon, full stop. Every phenomenon I was talking about was a complex phenomenon that is measured this way or worse.